Please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
Now let's head back to that conversation that Shereen is having with the Canadian Prime Minister.
Our Paris commitments, we're actually going to reduce our climate emissions, and one of the things I was able to do to get our oil-producing province of Alberta to sign on to that national plan is to say, well, we're going to build a safe and secure pipeline to continue to get oil resources to market in a reliable way while we move forward in this transition, because we're not going to switch off onto renewables overnight. It's going to take some time. While we're getting that, you have to make decisions and you have to make choices around the best path to get there. There are still people out there, however, who would say that there's still a choice to be made between the environment or the economy. Whereas a lot of people in my country and around the world understand that the only way to build a sustainable economy for the future is to protect the natural world, protect the environment, and to do them both together. Well, doing them together means doing things that, if you look at the people who are on the fringes of either debate, who want absolutely, nothing on the economy and everything on the environment, or everything on the environment and nothing on the, or you know what I mean. Well, no, I'm going to find a middle ground that will probably upset a lot of people, but most people get that you have to move forward in a responsible way.
Well, speaking of the economy and speaking of finding a middle ground, I think it was, 3 days ago that the U.S. ambassador to Canada said that Justin Trudeau and President Trump have more in common than most realize. A, how do you respond to that? Do you have more in common with Donald Trump than most people seem to realize?
That's actually something that I've been saying for an awfully long time. People look at me, a Canadian liberal with all sort of the openness and the values that I have, and they say, well, that's a big contrast with President Trump. And I actually have to point out to people that both President Trump and I got elected on a very similar approach. I made the case that the middle class in Canada, that hardworking people, hadn't been the beneficiaries of the growth we've had over the past decades, that the wealthiest are doing well, but ordinary hardworking folks haven't had the benefits of, whether it was trade deals, whether it was investments, whether it's tax schemes, whether it's whatever it is, people were feeling left aside or left behind in the growth of our economies. Donald Trump had a very similar approach. He was going to make America great again for the folks who feel that progress, that automation, that offshoring, that all the different changes in our global economy have not helped them out. Now, the two of us have very different approaches on how to solve that, but we come and look at it at the same problem, which is we have to make people who feel like they are no longer confident that the future holds much promise for them, or worse, for their kids. We have to reassure those people and make them optimistic about the future. And that's been at the core of my approach for the Canadian economy. And little spoiler alert, it's working really well, our approach in the Canadian economy. We have the fastest growth in the G7. We have the lowest unemployment we've had in 40 years. We've added hundreds of thousands of new jobs. We're doing it specifically, and this is where I differ slightly from the American administration, we're doing it by lowering taxes on the middle class, but raising them on the wealthiest 1%. We're doing it by delivering a Canada Child benefit to 9 out of 10 Canadian families who need it. That my predecessor the previous government had a child benefit system that sent checks to everyone just for having kids. I said, you know what? Let's send larger checks to the ones who need it most and the middle class, and stop sending checks to the wealthiest. Because, and you guys are in economics, you're business folks, you know that people who really need the money, who get a little extra money every month to help with their kids, raising their kids, will spend that on school supplies, on new clothes, on childcare, on things that keep the economy going. And wealthier folks will sort of not change their behaviors and put it aside for an education fund, which is worthwhile, but it's not having the same impact on the economy. So these are things we're doing that is delivering, and we're actually able to lower taxes for businesses, for small businesses. We're investing in innovation and research with this money. We're looking at the future with a real optimistic eye.
So now that we've established there's a lot more in common between Justin Trudeau and Donald Trump, is there commonality on your approach on NAFTA as well? Have you been able to find middle ground on that?
Again, President Trump wants a deal out of NAFTA that's going to benefit workers in his country. That's something that we want too in Canada. And not just we don't want just to benefit workers in Canada, we also want it to be good for workers in the United States. We believe that trade deals can be win-wins, or in NAFTA's case, win-win-win with Mexico. It's not a zero-sum game. It just means, however, for us, ensuring that the trade deal that you sign is actually specifically focused on benefits for people who historically haven't benefited from trade deals. I mean, we know trade is good for economic growth, but it's been mostly good for the 1%, for multinationals, not for small businesses, and for a country's bottom line. It hasn't necessarily, I mean, trade will create growth. It doesn't necessarily ensure that that growth is fairly distributed. So to make sure that there are opportunities for everyone to succeed, you have to build those into trade deals. And that means labor standards. That means thinking about gender issues and creating pathways to success for women in the workplace. It means looking at Indigenous peoples and marginalized peoples and making sure that they have opportunities to succeed, small businesses have opportunities to succeed. So there are ways to make trade deals work for the people that I want to and President Trump want to help. We're just working hard on getting to that, and negotiations are always challenging.
Since we're talking about trade, let me ask you about trade between Canada and India. It's well below potential. I mean, 3% of persons of Indian origin make up the population of Canada. Is the fact that there is no bilateral protection agreement in place holding back economic ties? Do you believe that post this visit we could see more momentum on the FTA deliberations that have been underway? Give me a sense of what we should realistically expect on the economic front.
We are certainly very interested in pursuing trade negotiations with a broad range of countries, including India. I mean, Canada has successfully, over the past years, at a time where trade deals have fallen out of favor and anti-globalization movements and worries about trade are rampant around the world, we successfully concluded a free trade deal with Europe, which is a market of 500 million people. We still have and will continue to have NAFTA, which is a trade deal with U.S. and Mexico. We just signed on to the CPTPP, which captures some of the largest and fastest growing economies in Asia, not the largest, but some of the fastest growing. And we're always looking for more. We've got trade deals with South America. Canada knows and Canadians know that trade is conducive to growth. So we're always excited to talk about trade opportunities, and we're respectful of the pace and the concerns that our partners will have. We'll never force a trade deal, but we're always eager to talk about deepening our opportunities. Right now, Canada-India trade is about $8 billion a year, which is great in goods, another $2 billion in services. But we do $2 billion worth of trade every single day with the United States. So there's a lot of room to grow, even given distances as a challenge. And when you think of the natural connections between Canada and India, obviously there's lots of really good business ties, trades in agricultural products. Canada creates produces a tremendous number of pulses, for example, which is a discussion we're busy having with the Indian government right now, where there's slight challenges. But there's so much more to do, and for us, the greatest potential of trade is the people-to-people connections. We have 125,000 Indian students in our universities every single year. We want to do much more. India is the #1 source of foreign students #2 source of foreign students in Canada, but definitely on track to being #1, perhaps even later this year if the trend line continues. Gujarat itself is is a significant proportion of that. I think the top 3, maybe the top 2 destination within India, source within India. So there are lots of great people-to-people ties, and we've increased that. As you know, we're a country that's open to immigration, open to trade. There are student visas. We have a startup visa program. If you're an entrepreneur and you want to start up a company, an innovative company in Canada, you can get a visa that way. We also have a global skills strategy. If big companies want to bring in engineers or senior folk from around the world, they can bring them in less than 2 weeks. There's a lot of things we're doing that hold great potential for deepening the opportunities for connections between Canada and India.
Well, that's good to hear. Before I throw it open to the audience, and we're going to come to you with questions, so please do raise your hands. We'll get a microphone across to you. Let me ask you the question on gender. You have a gender-balanced cabinet. You've said that the G7 will do things, will take decisions keeping gender parity as a priority. In terms of the unfinished agenda, pay equity legislation, for instance, what can we expect?
Well, first of all, I'm a feminist. And anyone in this room, yeah. And I spent many years wondering whether or not I could call myself a feminist because, it's a word that has certain connotations and certain loaded meanings depending on whether you're talking first wave, second wave, third wave. There can be very complicated elements to it. But at the very root of it, it's really simple. If you think men and women ought to be equal and ought to have the same opportunities, and if you recognize that there's still a lot of work to do to get there, and guess what? You're a feminist too. It's that simple. And understanding that empowering women and giving them opportunities to succeed isn't just the right thing to do or the nice thing to do, it's the smart thing to do, is extremely important. We are underperforming as communities, as societies, because we are not giving women the opportunities to contribute. We are not allowing them the opportunities to fulfill their entire potential. And you can't have a successful society or economy if you have 50% of the population that is not contributing as fully as they can. When we allow and continue to accept that there are barriers to women's success built into our system, some of them are overt, sexism, discrimination. Some of them are more subtle, just the fact that women have an expectation laid on them that they will be much more involved in raising kids. That challenge of looking at 2 CVs, one of a man, one of a woman, will lead to different decisions by a manager or by whoever's doing the hiring, which is one of the reasons why, yes, we're moving forward on pay equity legislation, but we're also looking at other things. I've talked about mandatory, like not just maternal leave, but parental leave with potentially mandatory or leave that can only be taken by the second parent, in most cases, the father. So it's either a use it or lose it. And as soon as you're creating a leave opportunity that use it or lose it, the second parent or the father, in many cases, or the second partner in a LGBT marriage, or whatever format you have, that path is removing some of the barriers and the obligations and the expectations that hold women back in the workforce. So there's a lot of things to do, and we're going to have, last federal budget in Canada was one of the first ever in the world to have an explicit gender lens put on it. We're going to do more in the upcoming budget that we're putting forward in just a few weeks. But there's always going to be much more to do. And you mentioned the G7. One of the things we're doing as hosts of the G7 this year, the G7 is the group of a group of 7 highly industrialized nations that come together every year to sort of discuss how they're doing and how we can positively impact the world. Every G7, there's a couple of themes that are put forward by whoever's hosting it that are unique. There's always discussions on jobs, on the economy, on security. This time I'm adding 2 themes. One, a theme on oceans, where we're going to talk about the state of our oceans, and particularly plastics and pollution in the ocean. But the other one is gender. And instead of just looking at it, okay, now we're going to turn to the gender discussion, we have a discussion on that. What we've done is we've made gender a horizontal theme through all the G7. So the discussion on jobs, the discussion on the economy, the discussions on security, the discussions on oceans, the discussion on anything we have will also have to it applied a gender lens, because it affects things differently. To give a perfect example of a gender lens, it's easy if you talk about a program on parental leave or childcare. Well, that's easy to talk about a gender lens to a certain extent. It's built in. But what would you have a gender lens be on pipelines, which was something you brought up? What does a gender lens do when you're thinking about building a pipeline? Well, actually, if you think about it, when you're building a pipeline through a remote area, which is where usually they go, you're talking about a whole bunch of construction workers who descend on mostly men, on a unpopulated or low population area, and that brings with it social and societal impacts around all sorts of things that do need to be thought about. So any policy decision can be thought about with a GBA plus analysis, which is gender, but the plus is also other intersectionalities, whether it's minority rights, whether it's Indigenous, whether it's LGBTQ rights, whether it's a broad range of issues that come in and layer on barriers to people's success. That's something that we're very much focused on. Again, not just because it's a nice or progressive thing to do. In some ways it can be an unpopular thing to do, but also because, and fundamentally because, it's the only way to build a fair and successful society, let alone economy, in the future when you fold in all those things.
You know, you talked about the subtle and obvious ways that women deal or have to face with sexism. And I remember during the course of your campaign, they said he's not ready yet, but he has great hair. So I guess you've had to deal with some of that as well. But let me throw this open to questions.
You know what? I am gonna respond.
You
to
are
that.
going to respond to that? Okay.
Yes, I had attack ads run against me saying I had nothing but nice hair, that I was, too fashionable to be smart, or whatever it was. And there were articles of, oh, is this just an example of discrimination the same way women goes through it? Let me be very, very clear. No, it's not. Okay? Any comments about how a man looks is not even an eyelash worth of the kind of systemic discrimination that women face every single day in any workforce. If I can contribute to the conversation by being spurring a conversation about it, that's fine. But as a man in politics and business, I've had loads of advantages that I never had to work for, that I never had to deal with. And I'm happy there's a conversation about, how you look and how you dress and how that impacts. But I didn't go through anything near the kind of intrinsic and entrenched discrimination and sexism and superficiality and judgments that women go through on a daily basis.
Well, I agree with you there. Let me get questions, and if you can raise your hand, please. Yes, right here. Can we get a microphone across? Yeah, go ahead.
It's an honor to have you here, Mr. Prime Minister. My question was, in the increasing global trend of nationalization and diluted boundaries being redrawn, how do you, as a global leader, see the world forward, and how do you plan to change it towards moving it further towards globalization?
There's a lot of different directions that answer could go, but I think the one realization I think we all need to have is that we are on a trend line as a planet towards more and more encounters with difference. I don't care how remote or isolated a community can be, the connection through media and internet and information that is now reaching everywhere, migrations of people fleeing because of climate impacts or resource depletion or just economic desires for betterment of their kids, or conflicts that are forcing people to move. The new reality for the 21st century is going to be more and more heterogeneous communities and societies. And the biggest challenge we are going to have as a species is doing something that India has always done fairly well, and that Canada does fairly well as well, which is understand that differences have to become a source of strength, not a source of weakness. That any problem that we're facing as a community or as a society, there's always an easy answer if you want to run for office and get elected, and that's point to a group of unpopular people and say it's their fault. We go for the othering. You try and point to the people who live across the river or across some imaginary boundary line that exists only on a map, or some religious divide, or some language divide, linguistic divide, or some ethnic divide, and you say, okay, that's the other, that's their fault. We're going to succeed when we knock them down and we lift ourselves up. That's been sort of the tribal approach to civilization that is, writ large through the past thousands of years. But we are now in a moment where that kind of tribalism, to use a word that I use in its most broad possible definition, us versus them, is breaking down. And there's two paths forward, I see, as societies and as leaders to take when you look at that. You can either amplify the anxiety that people feel about a transforming world, and how are my kids going to get good jobs in a world of AI, of competition on a global scale? How are we going to move forward? I'm really worried about that. And you can get people who say, well, let me amplify that fear and say, yes, it's those people's fault, or it's that country's fault, or it's this thing that we're going to do. Or you can take a more successful, pluralistic approach of saying, well, you know what? When we actually meet people who have a different story from us and a different background from us, we learn, we grow. You create more resilient communities. But the challenge around that is identity starts to break down. If you think of what a typical citizen of France, or a typical citizen of South Korea, or a typical citizen of South Africa might look like, you might have certain images that come into your mind. But as you get more heterogeneous societies, more pluralistic societies, that idea of a typical citizen no longer rests on surface attributes: language, religion, ethnicity, ideology, those sorts of things. It actually is anchored instead, or should be as an identity, anchored in shared values, values that a society collectively ascribes to and subscribes to. Well, as we define ourselves more and more through shared values that anyone from any part of the world can come and adapt to, and that's what we're doing in Canada, where the definition of what it is to be a Canadian has nothing to do with what you look like, has much more to do with openness, compassion, a willingness to work hard, a desire to be there for each other, a love of hockey, a search for justice, things that everyone can agree with, although we're getting more and more cricket pitches in Canada now. This approach is something that a lot of societies are struggling with, and there is, in many places, a turn inwards towards nationalism or protectionism as a way of holding on to a way that we used to be, a nostalgia for the good old days that were very rarely really good. Instead of saying, okay, the world is changing, let's embrace it. And that's what we're doing on immigration in Canada. That's what we're doing with pluralism. That's what India, as a pluralistic place, has always done reasonably well with and can always do better, just like we can do better, particularly with our Indigenous peoples in Canada. So this is a trend line that I think is really, really interesting, and it comes down to a fundamental choice that, if I can be ageist for a second, young people tend to get more than anybody else. That openness to the world, that excitement about being challenged with new ideas, with differences, is something that young people grab onto a lot easier than folks who are more set in their ways and expecting the world to unfold a particular way. So that's why I try and spend as much time as I can speaking with young people, to both be inspired and challenged by you, but also make you understand how important you are and the choices you make about the kind of world we're going to live in is in defining what that world looks like.
Well, we've seen you do the Bhangra. Can you play cricket as well?
Not very well, but I can.
Okay, he can. Yes, more questions. Yes, can we get a microphone to, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Hello, sir. So just a follow-up on this question. See, you said we have more Sikhs in our cabinet than the Modi government. So you have war veterans, astronauts, and doctors in your cabinet. So I think as a country, the largest democracy, we are having issues of poor representation of all the Sikhs of the society in our parliament. So my question is what is the importance of good representation of all the sects of the society in running a successful government? So this is my question. Thank you so much.
I think every society has challenges around representation. I am proudly a leader with a gender-balanced cabinet, as you've said, but my own political party has only about 26% women elected as MPs. We have a long way to go to actually get to better representation. We have underrepresentation of a broad number of groups in Canada, underrepresentation of Indigenous people in our government and in positions of authority throughout society. So there's always going to be different challenges in moving forward on that. And I think the fundamental element of it goes back to that first question of respecting diversity and differences and including differences in a way that is open to them and that values those differences of approach, those challenge functions that we all have to have as important. That's where, as much as a leader, I can tell you, the media is a constant frustration to me.
Why? What have we done?
Because they are fulfilling a fundamentally important role of challenging government, saying, well, are you really doing this right? And have you not done this wrong? And they seem to be amplifying everything I do wrong and don't talk nearly enough about all the things I do right.
But even that's the job of the media, is to hold government accountable.
But that's exactly my point. That's an essential function that on a personal level is frustrating to me, but on a level of what is in the interest of my country is something that I absolutely recognize as being essential. So however much I get frustrated at an article in the newspaper or online that I see, it's essential that we empower and we support our media, which is why in Canada we're doing more to help with the transition towards digital, and we're trying to make sure that there continues to be a strong independent media, and I do regular press conferences and all that. But it's just to say that a variety of voices, a variety of perspectives, whether it's in diversity or whether it's from different roles and functions, the challenge function of the Supreme Court against Parliament, the challenge function of our upper house against our lower house, the challenge function of the media asking tough questions, the challenge function of minorities that haven't felt properly recognized, valorized, and supported. Those are all the things that we should embrace as essential to successful democracies. Because as soon as we start not accepting that criticisms are essential to a robust society, then we start down a direction that isn't going to lead to the best possible outcomes for citizens in general.
Okay, let me get some questions in from this side. Yes, the lady right there. Go ahead.
Hello, sir. My name is Mayuri. I am from School of Liberal Studies, Pandit Deendayal Petroleum University. I'm majoring in economics. My question, well, sir, at the advent of protectionism, as you said, Canada opened its borders to refugees. My question is that these people need to be integrated into the community, the Canadian community. So what is Canadian administration doing for their education?
Excellent question. Canada's immigration system has long been anchored in two aspects. One is the immigration stream, and one is the refugee stream. People who are economic migrants looking for a better future for their kids come through the immigration stream. And we're approaching 1% of our population as the number of immigrants we take every year. So we take a little over 300,000 for a population of 36 million. So this is something that throughout Canada's history has been incredibly beneficial. People coming to try and build a better life for themselves has been unbelievably positive in both shaping who we are as a country, but also contributing to incredible success and economic growth for our country. But we also, as signatories to the UN Convention on Refugees, accept that anyone coming to our country who lands in our country and claims asylum status needs to be examined to see if they're a refugee. We believe in welcoming people who are refugees. Our immigration system is largely a merit-based system. So you have to have a certain number of skill levels to be an economic migrant, and then there's family reunification, spousal reunification, and lots of other categories as well. But the refugee stream doesn't look at those qualifications, doesn't look at anything. It just looks at whether or not you are, in fact, a refugee. And that's an important distinction, because a refugee is someone who no longer has a citizenship, basically, no longer has a state, a home country that will protect them, either because of conflict and strife that means you cannot simply go home. Syria is a great example, and why we took over 40,000 Syrian refugees in my first year in office. But there are other people who, because of identity, because of tribalism in some cases, are so discriminated against that their own government either can't protect them or is complicit in the marginalization and discrimination. Therefore, they're fleeing persecution, war, violence, and they have no place to go, and we will take them in. So that's a really important distinction, that if someone just comes to our border and says, look, I'm looking for a better life, we'll look at them and say, well, are you really fleeing torture and persecution, and you have no choice but to try and flee your country with nothing but the clothes on your back? That's an important analysis. But regardless of how someone comes to Canada or where they come to Canada, we invest significant amounts in integration programs, language acquisition, education, healthcare supports, social supports, so that people are able to succeed. And a few years of social supports and they become contributing members of society in most cases. And that's part of the investment we have in understanding that immigration is a good thing. But it's also why there has to be a limit on immigration, because there is only so many people that we can invest in language classes and training and support stuff. So we're doing as much as we can, but quite frankly, more countries need to do more about welcoming in immigrants and refugees particularly, not just, again, because it's the right thing to do, but because people who flee areas of war and persecution and just want a better future for their kids, inevitably work incredibly hard, are incredibly grateful to the country that welcomes them in, and end up contributing tremendously to the well-being of our society, of our country. That's been the Canadian story, and it's one that I try and remind people of around the world all the time.
Excellent. We've got a couple of minutes more, so I'm going to give the lady there. If you can stand up, they'll get you the microphone. A little bit Yeah, excellent.
Good afternoon, sir. It's a privilege to talk to you. I'm a huge fan of your Quora answers. So my question to you today is, are you inspired by any Indian leaders? If yes, then what are the qualities that you admire about them?
I think there's probably a lot of answers I could give, but I just had, seeing as though where I am and where I got to visit earlier today, I have to say that Mahatma Gandhi is an inspiration and should be an inspiration to us all. The idea of extraordinary strength in compassion and peace and nonviolence. The idea that, we always look at strength as being, being strong and being able to push others around. But it takes a tremendous amount of strength instead to be strong without having to be aggressive, without having to pick fights. Instead, looking at how to better understand each other and how better to question yourself as well. Because the challenge about being truly open to others is not that you have to listen to them, it's that you actually end up maybe questioning some things that you thought were true in your own mind and your own approach. And that can be really, really scary. And that idea of trusting in others and trusting the truth of others and standing strongly, incredibly strongly for your principles and your fundamental beliefs is something that is as necessary, if not more necessary now than it was 50, 100 years ago. I mean, the challenges we have as a world require an ability to de-escalate conflict, to approach things with humility, with less ego, with less pride, with more understanding, with more gentleness, but a calm firmness and a resolute belief in what is right, and that if you trust to the highest degree your fellow citizens, if you believe in the goodness inherent in everyone and you create opportunities for that to come out instead of looking to push against, as scary as that is, that idea that we should deal with our citizens as intelligent, reasonable folks instead of trying to scare them into voting one way or divide them into voting another way, I think is something that we all need to reflect on. And as far as inspirations go, Gandhi is about as good as we could get. And I might give a different answer somewhere else around the world, but maybe not either, because he is such a universal beacon of that kind of hope.
Well, we're out of time, so one last question, Prime Minister. What is this thing that you're most afraid of? I mean, your whole campaign was built on ambition, aspiration, hope, optimism. But what are you most afraid of today as you look at the world?
Cynicism. When people start thinking less of their institutions, of our society, people start thinking the worst of their neighbors, of their fellow citizens, of people around the world. I mean, it's easy to be cynical. It's lazy to be cynical. It's harder to be hopeful. It's harder to, strive for the best. It falls into earnestness or being uncool. Because, it's cool to be cynical, too. I mean, think about the word cool, right? It means detached. It means I'm cool. No, oh, you just fell and hurt yourself. No, I'm cool. Don't worry about me, Do you need a hand? No, I'm cool. That cool factor is to be detached, to be cynical. Voting is uncool. It's a deeply uncynical act. It's saying, wow, I put a little X on this piece of paper, and I'm going to change my government or my governance for the better. I'm going to make my voice heard, even though it's just one in millions. That idea that it's tempting to detach oneself from caring too much about one's society, one's neighbor, that's a trend line that is very, very worrisome for me. And it's extremely tempting in this world to draw easy lines around this community or that community and say, oh, this person is this way, or that person is that way, and politics is never going to change because they're all the same, or the media is all the same, or our institutions break down, or businesses are all the same. No. Instead, to be hopeful and to say, you know what? How I have a positive impact on the world around me matters deeply, not just because I'm making the world a better place, but it'll make me better and happier and perhaps inspire others to do the same. That is something hard to do. And the more we foster and encourage cynicism in indirect ways or direct ways as a society, the further we get from the place I think ultimately we need to go, which is citizens who understand that each and every one of us are active and empowered forces for good. And as I look at this room and all the folks watching in rooms like this and auditoriums like this across the country and perhaps even around the world, know that all of you matter so deeply. The choices you make around how you shape the world that you want to grow up in, that you want to succeed in, starts right now. You could look at a room filled with brilliant students like all of you and say that you're the leaders of tomorrow, but that forgets that you're already supposed to be leaders today. That everything you do, every way you activate, every choice you make, every word you speak to a friend or a colleague or an opponent shapes the world around you. And fighting against that temptation to sort of shrug it off and say, oh, the world's going in the wrong direction and nothing I can do can help it. Or the world's going in the right direction and I don't have to do anything to keep it going in the right direction. Is dangerous. We have, and you have specifically, this gift of education. We need to make sure more people have that. More people have opportunities to ask tough questions, to empower themselves, to shape the world around them. And it comes with a responsibility for everyone who can't be in these auditoriums. We have to think deliberately and hopefully and responsibly about the future we build, about the future you are building every single day. So I worry about cynicism.
Justin Trudeau, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you very much for joining us here, and thank you very much for your time.